When my daughter came home crying, I didn't understand at first. She was usually strong, not the kind to let teasing get under her skin. But that day, she hid her face in her hands and whispered, "Mom, my teacher made fun of you." I froze. "What do you mean?" She sniffled. She said it's inspiring that some parents still make time to help despite their circumstances. Then she pointed at your shoes. My shoes. The old brown flats I'd worn that morning when I dropped her off, the same pair I'd had for years, scuffed but still sturdy. I'd been rushing out of a meeting at one of the construction sites and didn't bother to change. I remember smiling politely when the teacher thanked me for making time. I didn't know she'd turned my shoes into a lesson in pity. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at those shoes. They weren't pretty, but they'd walked me through more than any pair of heels ever could. Through mud, through building sites. Through years of hard work building something that would outlast me. I thought about how easy it is for people to assume they know your story just because they can see your shoes. The next morning, I put those same shoes back on. Drove my daughter to school. Walked her to the door. When her teacher saw me, she smiled that condescending kind of smile. "Good to see you again," she said, glancing briefly down at my feet. "It's wonderful that you're so involved. Not every parent has the luxury of time." I smiled back. "Well," I said, "some of us make time for the things we build." She didn't understand what I meant. Not yet. Later that afternoon, the school hosted its annual fundraiser. Parents and faculty gathered in the courtyard, sipping wine, networking. The principal stepped up to the microphone to thank everyone for attending. Then he smiled toward me. "Before we begin," he said, "we'd like to recognize the person whose company made this entire campus possible, the woman who turned a sketch on paper into the school you see today. Please welcome our lead architect and primary investor, Ms. Reyes." The crowd clapped. The teacher's glass froze halfway to her lips. I walked to the stage slowly, those same scuffed brown shoes tapping against the marble floor. She walked across every morning. I smiled at her as I passed. Her face went pale. When I spoke, I kept it simple. I built this school for children like my daughter, to remind them that no one's worth is measured by appearance, status, or how new their shoes are. The foundation of this place isn't made of stone, it's made of second chances. The applause that followed was polite, stunned. The teacher couldn't even look at me. My daughter, though, she stood taller than I'd ever seen her. Afterward, she hugged me tight and whispered, "You wore them on purpose, didn't you?" I smiled. "Of course. They've carried me farther than judgment ever could." My daughter's teacher mocked my old shoes. She didn't know I built the school. And the best part? I still wear them sometimes. As a reminder that quiet dignity always outlasts loud ignorance. When my daughter came home from school with red eyes and trembling lips, I thought another child had bullied her. But when she finally spoke, her words landed heavier than I expected. "Mom," she whispered, "my teacher said it's sweet how you still come to pick me up even though you probably can't afford new shoes." I stared at her, confused. Then I remembered the day before, rushing from the construction site, dust on my sleeves, those old black flats on my feet. The ones I'd worn since before the divorce. I'd smiled at her teacher that morning, thanked her for looking after my child. I hadn't noticed the glance she gave my shoes. The kind that lasts half a second but tells you everything. That night, while my daughter slept, I sat on the porch and looked at those shoes. They were worn, sure, but they'd walked across every piece of land I'd ever turned into something beautiful. The first office I'd designed, the first contract I signed. The foundation of the first building that carried my name on its cornerstone. Those shoes had built an empire, quietly, step by step. I didn't tell my daughter what I planned. The next morning, I dressed the same, simple blouse, hair tied back, those same flats. When I arrived at school, the teacher smiled too brightly. "Good morning, Mrs. Alvarez. We're so lucky to have such dedicated parents." Her eyes flicked down. There it was again, that subtle pity dressed as politeness. "Dedicated," I repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose you could say that." That afternoon, the school hosted its annual donor luncheon. The kind where teachers and administrators praised the people who wrote checks big enough to keep the lights on. I'd been invited, of course. Though they didn't realize yet who I was beyond a name on the plaque by the front gate. Halfway through the event, the principal took the microphone. "Before we continue, I'd like to introduce someone very special, the woman whose vision, design, and funding made this school possible. Please welcome our architect and primary investor, Mrs. Elena Alvarez." I stood. The teacher's face turned white. I walked to the front slowly, the sound of my worn soles echoing on the polished floor she walked over every day. "Thank you," I said. "I built this place because I believe every child deserves a foundation strong enough to carry their dreams. And I believe in teaching them that value isn't measured by what we wear, but by what we build." My eyes found hers in the crowd. She looked down, unable to meet my gaze. When it ended, my daughter ran to me, her little arms wrapping around my waist. "Mom," she whispered, smiling through proud tears, "you showed her." "No," I said quietly, kissing her hair. "I showed you." The next day, I wore the same shoes again, on purpose. Because the woman she pitied was the same one who built the ground she walked on. My daughter's teacher mocked my old shoes. She didn't know I built the school. And I didn't need to correct her. The walls around her already did. When my daughter came home quiet that afternoon, I knew something was wrong. She's usually all chatter, stories, drawings, questions, but that day, her voice was small. "Mom," she said, "my teacher laughed at your shoes." I blinked. "What?" She told the class, "It's so admirable that you still come pick me up even though you must be struggling." She said not everyone has the privilege of nice things. I didn't answer right away. I looked down at the shoes by the door, old, scuffed at the toes, cracked at the heel, the kind you stop noticing when you've worn them through years of work, dust, and rain. They weren't beautiful, but they were honest. I'd worn them through the early mornings and the late nights that built everything we had, including that school. I didn't sleep that night, not out of anger, but out of reflection. People like her teacher, they mistake simplicity for failure. They think dirt under your nails means you've fallen behind, when sometimes it means you've been building the ground they stand on. The next morning, I walked my daughter to class wearing the same shoes. Her teacher smiled, that shallow kind of smile that says I mean well, but not really. "Good morning, Mrs. Tran," she said. "I just love how involved you are. Parents like you make such a difference." I smiled back. "I try," I said. "After all, this place is important to me." She didn't know how true that was. That afternoon, the school held a ribbon-cutting ceremony for its new arts building. Parents, teachers, even city officials gathered around, champagne glasses in hand. The principal cleared his throat and said, "Before we begin, I'd like to thank the visionary who made this expansion possible, our lead architect, designer, and primary benefactor, Mrs. Lynn Tran." The teacher's head turned. Her eyes went wide. I stepped forward, those same worn shoes tapping against the polished floors her students walked every day. I took the microphone, smiled, and said, "It's funny. When we were designing this school, I wanted to make sure the foundation was strong enough to hold the weight of future generations. I guess I should have added one more lesson to the blueprint, that strength doesn't always come dressed in something new." There was polite laughter, but the message landed. The teacher flushed pink and looked down at her hands. My daughter beamed from the crowd, pride radiating from her like sunlight. Later, as we drove home, she asked, "Are you going to buy new shoes now?" I shook my head. "No, sweetheart. These are the shoes that built her classroom." My daughter's teacher mocked my old shoes. She didn't know I built the school. And I didn't need her apology. The sound of my daughter saying, "That's my mom," was enough. When my daughter came home from school that day, she looked small in a way I'd never seen before. Her hands twisted the strap of her backpack, her eyes glassy but stubbornly dry. "Mom," she said quietly, "my teacher said something weird today." I turned off the stove. "What kind of weird?" "She was talking to another teacher and said it's inspiring that you still come pick me up in those old shoes." Then she laughed. It took me a moment to understand. Then I looked down at the shoes by the door, the same pair of worn leather ones I'd had for years. Sturdy, comfortable, stained with the dust of construction sites and late night inspections. I'd worn them the morning I dropped her off, straight from a project meeting. They weren't pretty, but they were mine. They'd carried me through more battles than that teacher would ever face. That night, I said nothing. I just listened to my daughter talk, trying to keep her voice steady as she asked, "Are we poor?" I smiled softly. "No, honey. We just don't need to prove anything to anyone." The next morning, I put on those same shoes. I even polished them a little. I drove my daughter to school, walked her to class, and met the teacher's eyes as she greeted me with that sugary tone people use when they think they're being kind. "Oh, Mrs. Rivera, always so hands-on. It's wonderful to see parents making an effort." I smiled. "Effort is kind of what I do for a living." She nodded vaguely, not realizing what that meant. Later that week, the school held its annual donor luncheon, an event meant to honor the community partners who helped build the new science wing. The one that had taken 2 years, 6 design revisions, and countless late nights to perfect. The one my firm had constructed from the ground up. When the principal took the microphone, his voice rang clear across the courtyard. "Before we begin, I want to thank the person who made this expansion possible, not just through funding, but through vision and design. Please welcome the architect behind the entire campus, Mrs. Isabella Rivera." The teacher turned pale. I stood from my seat, walked to the stage in those same scuffed shoes, and smiled as the applause rose. "Thank you," I said into the mic. "When I first drafted the plans for this school, I wanted to make sure it stood for something. Not just education, but integrity. A place where children learn that worth isn't measured by what you wear, but by what you build." My gaze met hers briefly. She couldn't look back. After the ceremony, my daughter hugged me so tightly I thought my heart might burst. "You didn't even get mad," she whispered. "There's no need," I said. "Some people learn by being told. Others learn by standing in the buildings you've built." The next day, I wore those same shoes again. Proudly. Because while some people walk to impress, I walk to build foundations. My daughter's teacher mocked my old shoes. She didn't know I built the school. And I didn't need her apology. Watching her face as the applause filled the room was enough. When my daughter came home from school that day, her voice was trembling. "Mom," she said, "my teacher made fun of your shoes." I laughed at first, thinking she was joking. But her eyes didn't move. She said it's nice when parents try their best, even if they don't have much. Everyone heard her, "Mom." I looked down at my shoes, the old gray ones I wore to site inspections. The pair that had survived concrete dust, spilled coffee, and half a decade of work. They weren't pretty, but they were part of me. They'd walked through every blueprint I'd ever turned into reality. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't rant. I just sat at my desk and opened the original plans for the very building my daughter's teacher worked in, the school I designed, the one my company funded and built. I'd never thought about my ownership as anything more than pride. But now, I saw it as perspective. Some people walk through walls others have built and think the floor under them was always there. The next morning, I dropped my daughter off as usual. Same shoes. The teacher smiled, overly polite. "Good morning, Mrs. Nguyen. Always lovely to see you." Her eyes flicked downward again. I smiled back. "Lovely to see you, too. I hope you're taking good care of the building." She blinked. "Excuse me?" "You'll understand soon," I said. That weekend, the school held its annual community gala, a formal event for parents, donors, and staff. It was held in the new auditorium, the one I had personally designed 3 years ago. Halfway through the evening, the principal took the stage and began his speech. "Tonight, we'd like to honor the woman who made all of this possible, the architect and financial contributor behind our beautiful campus, Mrs. Lean Nguyen." The teacher's glass froze mid-air. I walked toward the stage in those same shoes, my heels clicking softly against the marble she stepped on every morning. The room was full of polite applause and stunned silence. "Thank you," I began. "When we built this school, I wanted to make sure it stood for something, not just education, but perspective. The idea that you never know who you're talking to, or whose foundation you're standing on. Sometimes the people who look the smallest are the ones holding everything up." My eyes met hers in the crowd. She lowered her head. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was awareness. Afterward, my daughter squeezed my hand and whispered, "You wore the same shoes on purpose, didn't you?" I smiled. "Of course. They built her classroom, too." The next week, the teacher couldn't meet my eyes, but she greeted me with quiet respect. And that was enough. My daughter's teacher mocked my old shoes. She didn't know I built the school. And I didn't need her apology. Some lessons teach themselves when you finally see who's been walking the hardest miles beneath your feet.